Welcome. You're listening to The Kevin Barrett Show, where we rush in to controversial topics where angels, like Amy Goodman, fear to tread. We're rushing into one today, that's for sure. I'm bringing onto my show probably the most controversial recent voice to suddenly be heard all across the 9/11 truth movement. Now, being controversial in the 9/11 truth movement means really pretty darn controversial, because the 9/11 truth movement is already controversial enough that, well, I know that having been hounded by drooling packs of state legislators and deluged with internet death threats and all sorts of fun stuff like that, I wonder how you could get more controversial. Well, my guest, Alan Sabrosky, has managed to do it. Within the past, few weeks, actually kind of building up over the past few months, Dr. Sabrosky has let it be known in no uncertain terms that he is convinced that the Israeli Mossad was behind 9/11. He's not the only one, but he's not one of the usual suspects. There are a lot of usual suspects, including probably about 9/10 of the Islamic world that thought that the day it happened. But there are other slower, more thoughtful, and perhaps better studied people, including folks like Dr. Michael Andrade, one of America's leading peace studies professors at the University of Minnesota, who has pretty much come to this conclusion, although not in so many words. And you can see his very sensitive and excellent work at gzmn.org. That stands for Ground Zero Minnesota. That's gzmn.org. And Dr. Alan Sabrosky, my guest today, is definitely one of those people, not a usual suspect, but an expert in the field of international relations and military affairs. He's got his PhD from the University of Michigan, right across the lake from me here in Wisconsin. He's known as a military affairs expert in general, former director of studies at the U.S. Army War College. And he just came out and said it flat out in a way that I haven't heard it from very many people. It was the Mossad behind 9/11. And of course, many of us in the 9/11 truth movement are scratching our heads saying, how can you be so sure, Alan? Sure, there's some evidence pointing that way, but there's a lot of evidence pointing at Bush and Cheney and people in the Secret Service and people in the Air Force too. So we'll hash all that out. But meanwhile, it is an honor and a privilege to welcome Alan Sabrosky to the Kevin Barrett Show. Welcome, Alan. How are you?
Fine, Kevin. Thank you very much. And I forgive you for being from Wisconsin, as those of us in Michigan call that open area to our west.
Yeah, it's the final frontier for you guys, I guess. Of course, I think
only
Detroit
in football season.
I think Detroit is the final frontier now. It's open for recolonization.
Detroit is the South Bronx that happened to move to the west.
Oh, boy. Yeah. Well, fortunately, we haven't been hit by anything quite that bad, although working people all over the country are really suffering these days.
That's an understatement. Aside from 9/11, just looking at the economy makes me glad I'm not young now.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look back in the big picture, you could almost say that we had very strong overall economic growth with no major interruptions, really, just minor ones from World War II right up until about 9/11. And since then, we've been dead in the water. So tell us a little bit about how shortly after the 9/11 attacks, you actually published an article casting down on those attacks, an article that was overlooked pretty much by the 9/11 truth movement until recently.
Well, Kevin, it wasn't actually published. About 2 weeks after 9/11, a local journalist asked me to do a background paper for her, and then to revise it in the first couple of weeks of November 2001. And I did it, and then simply put the entire issue aside, completely aside, and paid no attention to it until after the Gaza strikes in 2008, 2009, and then a video I saw by a Danish demolitions expert, Danny Jowenko, in April 2009 on Danish TV, looking explicitly at WTC-7.
And Danny Jowenko is actually Dutch, but they're showing it on Danish.
No, right, but it was on Danish. But it was on Danish TV.
Yeah.
I wasn't even aware that WTC-7 had gone down, and so those two sort of galvanized me. But the initial one, and the initial paper that I did, and I was just reviewing it this morning, and I normally don't read excerpts from papers I've written, although Mark Glenn was kind enough to read the article I'd done on Jewish nationalism. But there's some parts of it here I think that, because the topic itself is very sensitive, as you pointed out, and I want to be very specific and very clear. And so, with your indulgence, I'm going to pull a couple of paragraphs out of it and just read topical sentences to give an idea of what I was thinking of and the questions I thought remained open, which is what this journalist had asked me to address, and that really formed some of my perspective on going into the whole 9/11 issue today. And the takeoff point, I think it will. I think your listeners will understand why when I go through this. And the second part in November 2001, when I revised it, was in response to something that Susan Sontag wrote about the media and Bush in an article in the New Yorker, for which she received an enormous amount of grief. And it occurred just as I was reading an editorial from a British wire service, I think it was ITN, on the evidence the U.S. had provided the British government regarding the culpability of bin Laden and company for the September 11th attacks. And ITN's position, their bottom line, was that there was no hard evidence. There was just an amalgam of supposition, allegation, innuendo, and guesswork. It bothered them, and it actually nurtured a nagging suspicion I had then for some weeks. And that suspicion was that while bin Laden and his outfit merit eradication for other things they've done, they may well not have carried out the September 11th attacks in their entirety. I knew that lists of names and associations showing they did so were surfacing, and they may have been accurate. I had no inside information. I wasn't playing inside the Beltway. But I do know that the fabrication of false identities is really child's play in the intelligence community. Right. And that given enough time, any decent intelligence setup anywhere in the world can manufacture evidence proving conclusively that, e.g., Mother Teresa orchestrated the September 11th attacks from beyond the grave.
Mm-hmm. That might be pushing it.
Well, that's pushing it a little bit, but not too far. I was trying to be a little bit dramatic for the journalist, and she laughed when she read it. Now that evidence wouldn't stand close scrutiny, but if no one cares or dares to scrutinize it, and that was Susan Sontag's point, so what? And besides, we began deploying forces to hit Afghanistan before they surfaced. So that made me see it in a rather jaundiced light.
Right.
But there were also some discontinuities in the way the September 11th operation apparently unfolded as it was reported. And one of them was Ari Fleischer's report that the afternoon of the attack, that they had clear and compelling information that both the White House and Air Force One had been targeted. And what I said to this journalist was, as a good press secretary, Fleischer might just have been providing a cover for Bush's absence from Washington and for some other things that the senior officials were doing. But if he was serious, I told her, then we need to understand that the information could only have come from a source that had prior knowledge of the attacks, and for some reason chose not to warn us that they were coming. And this is simply because, having worked in that community, in the hours immediately after the attacks, there was simply no time to review existing information in our possession, much less put out directives requesting new intelligence. So my questions at that point were, who provided the information, and why didn't they warn us ahead of time?
Now, by the information you're talking about, the report that Angel is next, meaning this was a threat to Air Force One that came through
exactly
on 9/11, apparently from people who had access to those top-secret codes.
Exactly. Why didn't they warn us? Second one was that, the operation itself, as it was supposed to have unfolded on 9/11, this is the official case, required an exceptional degree of discipline, close timing, and coordination. And pulling off something like that put a strain on any special operations force in the world,